We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Hello and welcome to The Interruption, the Global Institute for Tomorrow podcast. Recently, Chandran spoke about his time in China during Chinese New Year, and just last week he was in India for one of GIFT's leadership programs. So, Chandran, what did you come across? What ideas do you want to share?
Well, the reason I wanted to share this particular ideas from my trip was the comparison with China, and I think also the oversimplification of the challenges India faces. And with the Indian elections coming up, everyone's talking about the elections and the workings of the world's largest democracy. My week in India made me ponder if the elections and the democracy that India is celebrated for will ever change the conditions that I saw during our program. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. So in a nutshell, we went to a rural area, which is about 2.5 hours outside Pune, which is the automotive capital of India. And we worked with a very creative organization called the Mandeshi Foundation, which is part of an offshoot of Mandeshi Bank, which is the first women's bank for rural women. And we're looking at some issues to do with farmer-producer centers. But what we saw there was essentially, and I'm not a newcomer to India, but what I saw there was shocking in terms of the devastation with regard to harsh climatic conditions. And in some ways, without overstating it, I thought I got a glimpse into what climate refugees and camps would look like, because we visited what was called a cattle camp in this part of India. And the conditions there was so stark, it was hard to imagine how a government operating within the confines of India's democratic systems could alter this, particularly given some of the stark statistics, which include something like, and we're told, something like 60,000 farmer suicides a year just in one state called Maharashtra. So, it's those things that I don't think make the headlines of the newspapers. Yet, ironically, we were in India last week when India and Pakistan were jostling over occupation of land. Yet tens of thousands of farmers in India every year commit suicide because the conditions are so bad in terms of the inability for them to sustain a living.
Okay, so I'm going to focus in on that statistic you put out there, which is 60,000 suicides in just one state. And you mentioned the government there. So what is the link between India's democracy and the level of suicide?
Well, the link is not one that I want to try and make a very direct argument about, but the issues that one is left to think about is that, for instance, where we were, the absence of the government. Where the government was mentioned, it was mentioned more as a hindrance and a bureaucracy rather than a support mechanism. And here again, I don't want to be too harsh on India, but I could not help comparing similar sort of work we'd done in rural China 3, 4, 5 months ago in an arid area of China as well, and where the presence of the government was everywhere. They were so interested in our work, and where the farmers looked to the government for leadership and they put in the hard work, and where the government felt its role was to support the farmers, give them all they could, and then the farmers were essentially empowered and enabled to do work. So to answer your question, the ability of the Chinese government to direct resources without any political hindrance from state governments, etc., is the answer to the type of dilemmas that large countries like India and China faces, and where it's also it has an ability to direct the best human resources, which is civil service talent, to address pressing issues. In India, we just don't see this. There is no state-directed investments, nor assistance in the rural areas, and many of these people are left to themselves. So what we saw in the cattle camp was essentially several thousand farmers whose land had been sort of left to be underutilized because of the bad drought conditions, thus to the effect that they couldn't feed their cattle, etc. And in a Hindu society like India, the worst thing for a farmer is to take the cattle to the butcher to essentially get a bit of revenue. And apart from the religious connotations, there is essentially the more economic consideration, which is essentially cattle is their primary wealth. So rather than kill their cattle, they go looking for places to essentially find some forage. So the foundation, with the help of donations from a couple of companies, has set up a huge, what they call a cattle camp, but it's actually a misnomer because it's the camp is for the people too. So the farmers come with their cattle to save the cattle. They're provided with sheds, etc., the most flimsy sheds. And then the foundation, essentially through donations and other areas of support, but not much of the government, essentially buys fodder for the cattle and provides food for the farmers. And I think when we were there was something like 18,000 cattle and over 2,000-3,000 families in this large area. What it did also show was how water had been completely mismanaged. The water table in many areas in that state had been depleted by over 90%. So an absence of any regulatory oversight to manage natural resources. And when you get down to 90% depletion of aquifers, you're in a catastrophic situation. How do you change this? Now, we didn't see any large-scale investments in agriculture, etc. And I think it really begs the question, which government for India, what future, and how do the poor in the rural areas benefit from the democratic vote they're all about to cast in a few weeks' time? And comparisons with China cannot be avoided.
Do you think then things are reaching a threshold? Things seem pretty desperate from what you said.
They don't seem desperate, they are desperate. You'll never see something like this in China today. Never. And in fact, how many countries in the world would you see something like this, except where it's war-torn? There's a catastrophe of sorts. We do see things like this, of course, in the Eastern Horn of Africa, Somalia, where there's been catastrophic drought, warfare, etc. But India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. India doesn't have war. India has a burgeoning technology center. It has engineers. It has a functioning government, supposedly. This is not a failed state. But what you look at, you think this is the essence of a failed state for a large country. This is not Somalia, where you could argue the apparatus of the government is essentially in shambles. This is India. This is the Maharashtra state is the state that where the business capital of India, Mumbai, is. This should not be happening in a state which is got some of the most advanced technical expertise in the world. Indians run some of the best banks in the world. Indians run tech companies. And you go back to India and you see this, and you think, how on earth is the government not able to leverage its human capital and its vast resources to address the most basic needs?
Yeah. So you discuss large countries and why India's government for a large country is not currently functioning the way it should. So what separates a large country's state governance compared to a small one?
Well, in a small country, depending small by population, but perhaps large landmass, etc., the scale of suffering is inevitably just smaller. The intensity of suffering for the individual, of course, would be the same, but the scale is unprecedented, and so it's compounded. So in a large country, you have resources that have to be shared and managed within a dense population matrix. So you have to really manage it very well. When you don't, then the scale is horrendous. So you get the levels of suicide that I just talked about. But if you are in a small country, and I can, I'll just mention a small country like you take a small country, Laos, in Southeast Asia. It's a very poor country, and it's beginning to develop, etc. But the deprivation and the scale is nothing like India. So while Laos it can be small, its government may not be that advanced. With a bit of aid, which I don't, I'm not promoting, you don't get really catastrophic outcomes except when there's war. So you could say Laos suffered its worst periods during the Vietnam War. After that, it sort of moved out of that dire condition. There is poverty, but it's not on the scale of India. And if you are to prevent tens of thousands of farmers from committing suicide, that is a situation that can only arise in a very large country like India. And therefore you need to be so well organized because you need to share limited resources. Laotians would have to share within the confines of the inability for the state apparatus perhaps to work in a way that everyone can have not equal access but reap the benefits. But in India it's very different. You've got limited resources, they have to be shared, and the consequences of bad management are catastrophic. So that's really the difference. I'm not suggesting that small states can afford to have bad governance, but the implications for people coexisting in large countries are much more severe.
Okay. So when you throw in climate change, you mentioned the phrase climate refugees earlier. How does that fit in with all of this?
Well, the state of Maharashtra, India is very seasonal, and its agricultural sector is seasonal, fed by the monsoons. The monsoons typically come around June, July, and then they pass through India. So India is very much dependent on the monsoons. Most people know it. Even the stock market is affected by the monsoons. So the monsoons are hopefully due in about 2-3 months. But this year, and in fact for several years, the inner areas of Maharashtra state have been essentially affected by drought conditions. So rainfall hasn't been as high as before, etc. So for the last 3 months, it has been very dry. And because groundwater levels have been depleted, there's not much water to be even extracted. Farmers essentially don't have enough water, so in monsoon-fed areas of the world, you depend on 1 or 2 crops during the monsoon, and then you essentially sell that, save some money, and then you live off your savings till the rains come, etc. You grow some other things in between, depending on your access to the marginal water flows that people depend on during the non-monsoon seasons. So what we saw here was now an extended drought period, which seems to be getting worse. Some of the predictions that scientists have come up with suggest that these will continue to get worse. So what we saw, I thought, was a glimpse into how severe these things can get and how burnt and dry the land can become. And a state like India can manage this. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be highly organized. It has to have a concerted effort towards managing these constraints with dams, water management systems, technology, alternative livelihoods for people, etc. So as climate change becomes more pronounced and we see droughts becoming much more extreme, conditions on the land are becoming a lot more harder. And unless their livelihoods are somehow integrated into a larger economic model in which the state is omnipresent, one can only see these conditions getting worse. And what I saw, and I think what all the participants saw, including the Indians from cities who were part of our group, was a shocking realization of how severe these conditions are. And if the predictions are they're going to get worse, then one can only imagine that many more people are going to suffer from essentially what is broadly, very, very harsh climatic changes in the climate.
So between climate change and the governance of large states, which you'd think would be two very separate issues, yet you've brought them together here in this discussion. How or what recommendations would you give voters or even just the Indian government for the upcoming elections? How to tackle this?
Well, I don't think I can give any advice to voters because, India is a democracy. People go out and vote. It's multi-party. I don't even know if I can give any advice to the Indian government, other than because they're a multi-party democracy, they exist within a very fractured democratic system. But the thing I'm keen on sharing with everyone is to really understand, and India is a stark example of a very unfortunate reality, that in these very large countries where there are such different climatic conditions, where there's a convergence of resource constraints, etc., there is no substitute to the institutions being extremely well organized and able to essentially protect people and get organized over long term. And I think, in a previous podcast, I've talked about the fight against climate change. It must continue, but it's kind of over. And now it's about mitigation. And mitigation is not about how rich people will adapt to a few more hurricanes and typhoons, and how large cities will protect themselves and get smarter. Mitigation also includes food supply systems, not to feed urban populations only, which will be important, but actually feed rural populations. And so for the advice or the wake-up call should be for governments like India, but they have a catastrophe looming if you look at some of the water statistics in India. And all effort should be placed towards organizing the states critically around these issues and therefore protecting livelihoods and essentially mitigating the catastrophic type of outcomes which seem always inevitable unless the state intervenes in a very strong way. That at the moment seems beyond the vision or the organizing principles of the Indian political system. It seems noisy, it seems robust, but it seems completely ineffectual. And one could then see it in the cities where even the building of roads in the business capital of India, Mumbai, seems to be left to farm hands, laborers, nothing managed properly, etc., which I think is an indication of a breakdown of a society's ability through the state to organize itself. So from the well in the rural village right through the highways being built in Mumbai, you see that same sort of malice, this inability to manage.
There's this huge disconnect then between the very top leadership and even just small leadership in, say, construction of roads like you just mentioned. Now, why then is it that the top government has to be so important? Why can't you just have states that effectively operate well by themselves or within a larger the constituency of the government but still provide effective leadership?
Oh yeah, I mean you could certainly have effective leadership at the state level too. But my wider point though is if you have multi-party governments like you have in India in the state, very rarely does one party have the type of majority mandate that allows them to essentially take on this sort of restructuring of the economy and investments and therefore run roughshod over vested interests. So you could, of course, but then in India you'd have to have, I forget how many states there are, but you'd have to have numerous states all operating in sync to do this. Clearly, if you have half operating at the sort of level that we're talking about in addressing these issues, that's better than very few. The point I'm making is I think the messy, noisy democratic system of India does not allow for this. and you have a democracy that is essentially captive to private interests that are so deep-rooted within the corrupt systems, etc., that the livelihoods of the poorest cannot essentially be handled. And that's why you need a mandate right at the center, which I'll use the word dictates how public money is going to be spent, and essentially in the interest of the majority poor in India takes authoritarian actions in the benefit of the small people. But that doesn't happen in India.
Well, Chandra, that's a controversial line to end on. I think it touches on a completely different podcast that we should get stuck into one of these days. But we've touched on climate change. We've touched on the state of Indian farmers and the tragic realities of how it is to be a farmer in India at the moment. But unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today, so thank you. If you are interested in the work we do at GIFT, please check out our website at www.global-inst.com or check out our Facebook page. Just search for The Interruption by Chandra Nair. Thank you.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.